Welcome back to Land Matters, the podcast of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I'm your host, Anthony Flynn. Imagine having a giant dashboard that reveals buildings and land use and open space and property ownership, all the critical components of what's happening literally on the ground across cities and towns, rural areas, farmland, forests, places that are susceptible to fire and flooding, a window on the world. Well, the technology actually exists today, and it's an incredible tool, thanks to the Center for Geospatial Solutions, founded at the Lincoln Institute in 2020. Its mission is to build a bridge between policy and practice by expanding access to new technologies to enable communities to meet the furious pace of change we see in the world today. Their award-winning team uses tools like satellite data and artificial intelligence to help policymakers get the timely, complete information they need to lead with confidence and realize more sustainable and equitable outcomes. I'm joined today by Jeff Allenby, Director of Innovation at CGS. Jeff is a founding member of the Center for Geospatial Solutions and brings a wealth of experience developing systems-focused solutions at the intersection of technology and the natural world. In his role, he leads the development of novel data and analytic tools needed to conserve, protect, manage, and restore resources. Jeff Allenby, thank you for joining the conversation at Land Matters.
Anthony, glad to be here.
Well, let's jump right into the work cited by the White House, which recently tried to encourage local governments to do more to create affordable housing. The team set out to find out how much publicly owned land exists in the U.S. and how much could conceivably be used for housing. So tell us about what you were working on and how it came to be cited by the White House.
So setting the scene, depending on the source that you go by, there's a shortage of between about 1.5 to 7 million units of affordable housing across the United States. But as they say, location is key. It's really in areas that are transit accessible, that are in urban areas, and are where the gap of affordable housing is most critical. Somewhat fortuitously, we had just completed our first national run of our Who Owns America analysis, which classifies the type of owner for every parcel across the country. And we really wanted to flex our muscles to be able to see what our data could do. So we ran an analysis to identify from about 165 million parcels across the country, which of those parcels are owned by government entities at the federal, state, or local level. And then from there to analyze what kind of affordable housing opportunity there was, identify parcels that did not have any buildings on them, or if they did, it was less than 1,000 square foot. I might have a shed on a parking lot kind of a thing, but readily developable. And through that, we went through and took a deeper dive on those government-owned parcels and excluded areas that were in floodplains, that were road right-of-ways, police stations, kind of everything that wouldn't be readily developable, and found that there's about 250,000 acres of government-owned land that was available for development in transit-accessible urban areas. These are areas that are within about a quarter mile of bus or a train station, that have at least one bus or train stopping by every hour in rush hour, and in urban areas. And depending on the density that you apply to those acres, you're finding somewhere between about 1.9 million additional homes for a lower density. That's kind of average to urban areas, kind of suburban areas, all the way up to about 6.5 to 7 million units of affordable housing if you're developing more at a multifamily, transit-oriented development standard. About 86% of this land is owned by local governments. So it really is falling to those city governments, municipal governments, where you have this opportunity. And a lot of these partners may not be thinking about the fact that this land is available for development. And so our goal was to really be able to provide kind of the entire world of opportunity that's there, to then be able to work with them to kind of pare it down and say what's actually developable, to be able to move that into affordable housing.
Just so I've got this straight, you said close to 2 million additional homes potentially, and that's even on a density model. Now, 2 million homes, that's about the shortfall in the housing supply that you talked about, right?
At the lower end, it matches up very closely on just government-owned lands. Obviously, not every acre of that land that we identified is going to be developed, but it really creates a strong basis that can move the needle on the overall need that exists.
It sounds similar to some additional analysis that the center's been doing, which is to figure out how much land is owned by faith-based organizations. And again, how much of any of that land could potentially be used for housing construction. This is part of the so-called YIGBY investigation, which is Yes in God's Backyard, a little play on YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard. So faith-based organizations, similar methodology that showed where this potential housing might go?
Yeah, it's very similar. The difference being we're looking at properties owned by religious institutions versus properties that are owned by government institutions. But the fundamental aspect of how do you start with all of the parcels across the country and then begin to start to focus down on a specific subset, whether that's development potential, whether that's conservation potential. The power of the Who Owns America analysis is that you can begin to ground some of these abstract policy conversations in reality and move from saying, we want to develop religious owned properties for affordable housing. The first question that people are going to have is, how many properties are there? How many acres are there? How many units could there be? What if we adjusted a minimum size from a quarter acre to a half acre? What impact would that have? And what our data allows partners to do is to be able to answer all of these questions in really near real time, because it's not taking weeks of analysis to come back with a different estimate. You're just putting a different filter on that data and just seeing how the number changes and seeing how, if it's accessory dwelling units, whatever else it is, you can filter parcels that meet your criteria to begin with. But then you can also do that dynamic scenario planning to be able to say, how does that change? You make the small tweak to a policy, what does that lead to on the ground in terms of opportunity? Through our work with the Lynch Foundation, who helped fund some of the analysis for Yes in God's Backyard in Massachusetts, we were able to really dive into not just the initial inventory of religious-owned properties that didn't have structures on them, stuff like that. We also worked with a team of students at Boston College to ground truth using things like Google Street Map to be able to actually evaluate the development potential to help ground the conversation in Massachusetts about how big of an opportunity is passing legislation to allow development on religious-owned properties. It really helps galvanize a lot of attention to be able to say, this really is an opportunity that is worthwhile to go through the legislative process. We've done similar work in Arizona. We're exploring similar work in Virginia right now and have the potential to be able to expand this nationally to really be able to have the entire conversation in aggregate to be able to say, what role could religious properties have in solving the housing crisis across our country? Pair that with government-owned land, pair that with private land, pair that with removing impediments to things like manufactured housing through exclusionary zoning. It really provides a lot of valuable information to guide some of these policy discussions and to be able to look at them in combination with each other to say, how do we actually put together a portfolio of policies that are going to move the needle as opposed to looking at everything singularly?
Yeah, that's the thing about this work. You can just keep going, right? When you understand the lay of the land, communities can then figure out what policy changes or perhaps zoning changes could accommodate this potential housing construction. So opportunities for so-called soft density or gentle density. You mentioned ADUs, manufactured homes, even something as simple as a 2 to 4 unit housing type, which tends to be less expensive than the single family home on a bigger parcel.
Yeah, I think this is really the power of Who Owns America and the information that we can provide to decision makers through things like web-based tools where they can actually go in, explore this data on their own without having to have a team of technical staff behind them, oftentimes providing them with a paper map, and any little change that they want to make to an analysis takes a week to come back to them. What we really see is that there is just an amazing amount of local context in this issue. You're not seeing investors buying houses across every neighborhood across the country. What you're really starting to see is certain neighborhoods with certain conditions being impacted more than others. Typically, that's lower income, higher minority neighborhoods where property values are a little bit lower. but rents are increasing, and the finances on the back end really allow investors to come in and make a lot of money by buying single family homes. This has dramatic impacts on everything from racial wealth gap, home ownership gap, and really without having the information to be able to assess this at the neighborhood scale, at the block scale, decision makers are really left with looking at things in aggregate over a city or over a county. And when you look at it in aggregate, you miss the nuance of where these impacts are happening, where the opportunities are on the ground, because you're only looking at averages. And what we're seeing as we work more on this data is that it's not the same everywhere. You have certain areas that are being impacted more. You have certain areas where you have a lot more opportunity. And by giving access to decision makers to be able to go in, see the data, zoom into the areas that they're familiar with and see how it validates their lived experience and their constituents' lived experience and be able to see how things are changing over time, that's where the power comes in. And where it really allows our partners who are working on the ground to be able to leverage this information, to be able to influence their policies, their decisions, and how they're approaching these challenges from the ground up.
So you mentioned institutional investors. Now, this is this trend where outside investors go into certain cities, including legacy cities, and they buy up these properties and then rent them out, unfortunately, charging exorbitant rents in some cases. So what you're talking about is providing cities with the means to look at, all right, what is the ownership of these properties parcel by parcel? And you don't have to get into detail, but there are ways to crank in your methodology to determine if it's an outside investor rather than owner occupied. Is that right?
Yeah. So the Who Owns America analysis looks at a variety of information contained within deed information, parcel information, et cetera, to understand, is a property owner occupied? Is it owned by a corporate investor or a non-corporate investor? Non-corporate being like if I owned 3 rental properties down the street for myself, but don't have them in an official LLC, as well as looking at whether it's in-state or outer state. And that really speaks to a lot of what you're just saying of kind of outside investors, not from the city, big national investors coming in buying houses, as well as the portfolio size. Something that really distinguishes our work from a lot of other work going on in this space is that we're doing a lot to trace back corporate ownership and looking at the actual portfolios of some of these large companies like Invitation Homes and Tricon and ABC Capital to actually understand how many properties they own in a market. And when you start to look at that, it's dumbfounding in some examples. You look at the city of Atlanta, and some of the top 20 of these large companies own over 30,000 single family homes in the metro Atlanta region. You look at some neighborhoods outside Memphis, Tennessee. Literally one company owns half the properties in a neighborhood. And you're really starting to see the impact that this can have. What it also allows you to do, though, is to be able to get that nuance, to be able to say, is it mostly out of state? Is it mostly in state? And what we're seeing is that there definitely is a role that these large national institutional investors are playing. There's a larger role that regional investors, that might just be operating in a city, those smaller, mid-size, somewhere in like the 20 to 50 property range, they actually are owning more properties than these big national investors when you're looking at individual markets. And when you look at where some of the hottest markets are in the country, it's not where you would necessarily expect it to be historically. It's places like Allentown, Pennsylvania, Akron, Ohio, kind of what you're saying, some of these legacy cities where you have enough demand for housing and rents that can support the returns that these investors are looking at, but property values are still low enough that the investments make sense on the financial side of things.
Let's step back and think about geospatial mapping in general and all of the technological advances that have taken place and really kind of turbocharged the field. I remember around 10 years ago, we had a big initiative, the Atlas of Urban Expansion, which attempted to describe the growth of built-up areas around the world in these megacities, particularly in the developing world. Great stuff for the time using satellite images, but there was a lot of estimating going on, and there was a sort of a sample set of cities, and everybody had to sort of apply that to what it meant for other places. Now, this kind of analysis, is it not the case, can be done in seconds or minutes and be completely accurate and up to date. So I'm just hoping you might reflect on the wow
Yeah.
factor here and this incredible tool and what it means for communities looking at all their policies.
Yeah, seconds might be a bit of an overestimation, but it definitely is a step change from what it used to be. And I think one of the biggest things is also in the automation piece. There's a lot of benefit and a lot of opportunity for organizations to be able to leverage technologies that have really become available in the last 2 to 5 years to be able to look at these widespread data analysis tasks that historically just never would have been able to be done with the technology even 5 years ago. Distributed computing, satellite imagery, all of these things are really allowing us to take on these big data challenges and in some ways move them to the background for partners operating on the front lines. The Atlas of Urban Expansion is a great example and has been cited for the last decade by partners around the world to really be able to understand how cities had developed, the role that land use planning or lack of land use planning had on density and urban sprawl in different scenarios around the world was fantastic. But what we've seen, as you said, with satellite imagery is that we can do this not just for the 300 cities that the Atlas had focused on, but for every city around the world and really move the analysis piece to the background. And so what we're looking more forward to is to kind of say, okay, now that we have this data, what else can you do with it? How do you start to overlay other things like water consumption, water use, and groundwater to understand maybe some of the implications or limitations of development on these cities? How do you bring in things like vertical expansion as well as horizontal expansion to be able to understand how some of these cities might be densifying through building more skyscrapers and kind of all of those pieces? And so whether it's the Atlas of Urban Expansion at a global scale, whether it's Who Owns America more domestically, there's a lot of work that cities and counties and states have been spending lots of time and money on that they don't necessarily is the best use of their time, that we're able to come in and just provide this insight to them to allow their staff to really focus on what do you do with the information now that you have it? How do you actually solve challenges on the ground versus spending all your time just doing the data analysis? And I think that excites me the most, how we have this power at our fingertips to really allow our partners to do more with the resources they have, the staff that they have, and the time that they have, and get more to solving challenges versus just dealing with data management on the background.
Just as a final thought, how does artificial intelligence contribute to that acceleration? That's part of this too, right?
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think what we're seeing is, at least what I'm seeing, is a lot of promise. I think we're still probably a couple of years out from seeing the full promise of AI within this space. What we really have, though, is just a massive amount of data. And one of the challenges and one of the massive benefits of AI is the ability to sort through mountains of data and figure out what's important and figure out what the trends are versus what's not important, what the noise is. We have a massive opportunity in particularly the geospatial world, but just in the data world in general, to begin to leverage all of the information that we have collected over the last 20, 30, 40 years. One of the challenges, though, is the ability to get it into a machine-readable format and to make sure that it's accessible as training data to these AI models to be able to work on it. And so that's where I think there's still work to be done. But based on what I've seen and the way that we're starting to use it, once you have good, clean data that's ready for AI to take on, that's where I think there's just a massive amount of insight that can be generated from very noisy data on the back end.
The future is here. Jeff Allenby, thank you for this time on Land Matters.
Thank you.
For more on the Center for Geospatial Solutions, you can visit their website at cgsearth.org. Also, by going to the Lincoln Institute website at lincolninst.edu. Scroll to the bottom and join our mailing list to get periodic updates on this and all of our work. Also on social media, the handle is @LandPolicy. Finally, don't forget to rate, share, and subscribe to the Land Matters podcast. We've got much more in store through the rest of the year, so stay tuned. For now, I'm Anthony Flint, signing off. Until next time.